This number on the front of your lens, the 2.8 or whatever yours says, do you know what it means? Most people don't. And for the 13 years I was shooting portrait sessions, I really didn't get it either. I knew what f1.8 was and that it created a really blurry background. And I also knew that the more expensive the lenses, the lower the number got. What I couldn't figure out is why is aperture talked about the way that it is? Terms like wide open and stop down or fast glass or narrow aperture. To me, none of it really connected to anything that made sense with what I was shooting. That confusion stuck with me until I actually thought through how to explain it to somebody else. And I came up with a much easier way of thinking about it that nobody ever said to me when I was learning. That's what I'm covering in this video. We're going to talk about what your lens can actually do, why the numbers are the way that they are, and the one simple way to think about aperture that finally made it click for me. But before we get to that, let's start with what's actually written on your lens, because there's information right on it that most photographers have never really looked at closely. If you've ever grabbed your lens and just attached it to your camera body, but never really gave much thought to the markings that are on front, you're not the only one. That number on the front of your lens is telling you the single most important thing about this lens, what the maximum aperture is that it can shoot with. And if you don't know what that means, you might be chasing a setting that your lens can't physically do. That marking, the 1 to 2.8 or just 2.8 or whatever your lens says, that's your lens's maximum aperture or smallest number. And you'd say it as 1 to 2.8 or just 2.8. The 1 is just how some manufacturers write the ratio. Just ignore it. The number after it is what matters. When I started shooting, I felt like shooting everything at f1.8 was the pro goal. And I quickly found out that more expensive lenses had even lower aperture numbers. So every time I shot, I would try to shoot with whatever my lens's lowest aperture was, but without fully understanding why. My thought at the time was that professional photography, especially portraits, always had a really blurry background. So I thought, that must be the thing I need to do to make my photos look professional. And that turned out to not be true, but more on that story later. Now, what if your lens has two numbers on it, like 3.5 to 5.6? That just means that your maximum aperture changes as you zoom. At the closer wide end of the zoom, the smallest available aperture number you have is f3.5. But at the farther telephoto end of the lens, the smallest available aperture number you have is f5.6. Lenses with this type of range that have two different aperture numbers at each end of the zoom are commonly found on kit lenses, or the lenses that come with a beginner camera starter kit. This is one reason why zoom kit lenses are cheaper. Zoom lenses that have one fixed aperture holds the same lowest aperture number no matter where you zoom, and they cost more to build. Let's take a minute to talk about the range of available apertures, in case you've ever wondered. The full range that most photographers will ever use starts at about 1.2 or 1.4 on the wide end to f16 or f22 on the narrow end. And you might notice those numbers don't go in a straight line. They jump from 1.4 to 2, then 2.8, then 4, then 5.6. And we're gonna go full geek mode here just for a minute, because why not? We're covering aperture and why it is the way that it is. The reason those numbers go in the order that they do is that each full stop represents exactly double or half the amount of light of the one next to it. And the sequence follows the math of that doubling relationship. So there's no f1.3 or f3 because those numbers don't land on the doubling pattern. Your camera does click through smaller in-between steps like f1.6, f1.8, but the main landmarks are the ones that represent clean doublings of the amount of light that's let in. You might also find it interesting to know that an aperture of f32 does exist on some lenses, but past f16, something called diffraction starts softening your images even as more of the scene comes into focus. So f16 is the practical ceiling for most shooting, or as you could say, it's the sweet spot. But here's why all these numbers matter, especially the ones that are written on your lenses. If someone tells you to shoot at f1.4, but your lens is only capable of going down to 3.5, you can't do it. So knowing what your lenses are actually capable of is the foundation of everything else. Now, let's pivot for a moment and talk about what aperture actually is. Inside the lens, there's a set of overlapping metal blades, usually between 5 and 10 of them, arranged in a circle, and you're probably already familiar with this. These blades open and close to make a larger or smaller opening, and that opening is the aperture. Think of it just like the pupil part of your eye. When you're in a room with really low light, your pupil opens wide to let more light in so you can see better. But in a room with bright light, it contracts and gets smaller, so it lets less light in and you're not blinded by the brightness. The aperture blades in your lens do the exact same thing, except you control it when you're in manual mode instead of it being controlled automatically like your pupil. And here's something interesting almost no one talks about. The number of aperture blades in your lens affects the shape of your background blur. Remember when I said lenses usually have between 5 and 10 of them? More blades means the opening stays more circular, giving rounder, smoother bokeh. And fewer blades means the opening is more polygonal. So you might notice pentagon or hexagon shapes in your out of focus highlights instead of circles. If you don't know how many blades each of your lenses has, you can search online and find out pretty easily. So now you know the range of available apertures and what's physically happening inside your lens. But knowing that still doesn't explain why the way aperture is talked about has confused photographers for years, especially me. Real quick, if you want a simple guide to manual mode settings, I have a free one called Shoot Like a Pro. The link is in the description. Most people learn aperture by looking at those side-by-side comparison photos of the same subject shot at different apertures. Ones like these, where there's a blurry background at one end and everything is sharp on the other end. And you can see where the lower f numbers are used, the blurrier the background gets. That gives you the practical picture of which aperture does what. And you can pretty easily figure out which number to pick based on how you want your photo to look. But then someone says, shoot wide open, or stop down a bit, or you need faster glass. And none of it mentally connects to those side-by-side comparison photos. Wide open sounds like a lot of space, but yet it's referring to the smallest aperture number, and stop down sounds like you should stop doing something. And fast glass? What does speed have to do with a lens? Or hearing the term narrow aperture for a higher number like f16, which shows you more of the scene, it all sounds backwards because these terms describe the physical mechanism of the lens, not what you actually see in your final image. Shooting portrait sessions for years, it seemed like using the lowest available aperture was always the goal. Like that was the real mark of a professional photographer. But when I'd read forums online or hear other photographers talking about shooting wide open, I could never fully admit that what they were saying really made no sense to me. But here's something that helped me once I finally did figure it out. These terms aren't random. They came directly from the physical mechanics of old manual film cameras. And we're gonna get super geeky here again for just a minute, so bear with me. It's actually pretty fascinating if all of this is new to you like it was to me. The aperture ring on those old manual cameras had actual click positions, physical stops it snapped into, each representing a doubling of the light or a halving of the light. When you turned the ring, you were literally stopping at a setting that clicked into place. That's where f-stop comes from. That's also where stopped down comes from, because you were clicking the rings towards smaller openings. And the f in f-stop, it stands for focal length. The f number is actually a ratio of the focal length divided by the size of the aperture opening. So f2.8 on an 85mm lens means the opening is 85 divided by 2.8, which is about 30mm wide. The whole terminology describes the physical mechanics of cameras that most photographers today have never seen or touched. But when photography went digital, the old language stuck around. The cameras changed, but the words didn't. So how confusing is that? So let's get out of geek mode and discuss what each term actually means. I promise you it will all come together soon, especially when I tell you the easy way that I taught myself to remember it. Wide open refers to your lens's lowest f number, its widest aperture, and lets the most light in. And you also get less in focus. Stop down means you are closing the aperture and making it smaller or narrower, and going to a higher f number and lets less light in. Fast glass refers to a lens with a really low aperture number, like f1.4 or 1.8. or especially 1.2. It's called fast because it lets in so much light when it's that wide open that you need to use a faster shutter speed to balance the exposure. Narrow aperture simply means a higher f number, less light and more in focus. And it's worth mentioning these terms aren't irrelevant on digital cameras. They're just describing what's happening inside the lens. And that's exactly why they rarely stick for anyone who's learned it from the outside in. So instead of trying to memorize the mechanism of what's happening inside the lens, I asked a different question altogether. What am I actually trying to control when I adjust my aperture? And that's when it finally clicked for me. Real quick, if any of this is already making sense to you, do me a favor and hit like. It tells YouTube to show it to more photographers who truly want to understand what the heck aperture is and how to use it correctly. When I started to think about how I would explain aperture to someone else who might be entirely new to this, I stopped thinking about the physics and the mechanics of it and asked, what does the photographer actually need to know in the moment that they're shooting? Definitely definitely not the confusing mechanism, just how much of the image is going to be in sharp focus. So here's the super easy way that I came up with to help me explain it better. A small aperture number means there will be a small amount of things in focus. A larger aperture number means a larger number of things will be in focus. I'm going to repeat it because I want it to be this simple for you too. A small aperture number means a small number of things will be in focus, and a larger aperture number means a larger number of things will be in focus. So at f1.8, only a small number of things in your frame will be in focus. Your subject is sharp or wherever you aim your focus, and the background gets blurred out the most. At f16, a much larger number, you get a larger number of things in focus in your frame. Everything in front of and behind your subject is usually going to be sharp. The number you choose tells you the amount of things or how much of your frame you're bringing into focus. So now when you're adjusting aperture at your session, you're not thinking about wide open or stop down. You're just asking yourself, how much of this scene do I want to get in sharp focus? That's the only real decision that needs to be made. Here's how this plays out in real shooting situations, so you have some guidelines to go by if you're not sure which number to choose. When you have a single subject and you want a blurry background, use anything from f1.4 to f2.8, or go as low of an aperture number as your lens allows. Your subject will be in focus and the background will be blurred. When you have 2 or 3 people and they're in the same row and you want a blurry background, use between f2.8 and f4. This gives you a little more depth in your plane of focus to make sure everyone is sharp, but you still get a pretty blurry background. If you're shooting a small family and everyone's roughly on the same plane, use at least f4 to f5.6. And if you have 2 rows or people staggered at different distances from you, use at least f5.6 to f8. In cases like this, your focus plane needs to cover more ground. And if you're shooting large groups with multiple rows, use at least f8 to f11. And forget about the blurry background altogether. Just get everyone in focus. A fully sharp group photo is worth keeping, but a beautifully blurry one where half the back row is soft and blurry is not. In my early days, I shot many family sessions at f2.8, and I would get so frustrated when people in the back row would come out soft and slightly out of focus, not realizing the fix was simply to increase the aperture to bring more of the people inside that focus plane. In my mind, the goal of a pro is to shoot with the lowest aperture every time. Little did I know, a real pro would have accepted the limitations of aperture and delivered a fully sharp photo instead of a creative mess. And one more thing while we're on this note, how far you stand from your subjects also affects how much gets in focus. The farther back you stand from your subjects, the bigger that focus plane gets. And that works for any aperture. And the more distance between your subject and the background, the blurrier that background will be when you're using a lower aperture. Those 2 things give you more control than just the f number alone. And the blurry background is simply a tool. It's not the goal of every photo. Knowing when to use it and when to let go, that's what actually makes a portrait work. Aperture is just one of 3 settings used in manual mode. If you want a simple guide that gives you settings recipes for real situations that you're going to be shooting in, so you're not guessing every time you pick up your camera, that's what Shoot Like a Pro covers. It's a free guide I created for you. The link is in the description. Go grab it. So now you know what the number on your lens actually means, what the range of f-stops looks like, and why the numbers change what you actually get in focus. You know why the terminology sounds backwards, and the one way to think about the numbers that actually connects to what you see in your image. But aperture is just one piece of the exposure triangle. Shutter speed and ISO are moving alongside of it every time you shoot in manual mode. And knowing aperture alone doesn't tell you how to balance all 3 when the light's changing and your subject is moving around. How does all of this tie into manual mode and the exposure triangle without it being overwhelming? I have a video on exactly that. If you've been frustrated with manual mode for years and you want it to finally make sense, and you want to know which settings to start with instead of just switching up your settings and guessing, watch this next. You'll see how easily all 3 elements work together, and you'll walk away with a clear starting point.